Ever feel like your brain is just constantly buzzing? Juggling a million to-dos and what-ifs?
Oh, yeah.
Keeping track of everyone's schedules, remembering appointments, making sure the pantry is stocked. It's like this never-ending mental hum of just running a family.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're diving deep into that often invisible mental load.
Right.
And we're exploring how it's divided up in families, specifically between mothers and fathers.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We all know about, who's doing the dishes or folding laundry, but
Right.
it's more than that. We're
Yeah.
talking about like the behind-the-scenes management, the anticipation, the constant decision-making.
Yes.
That can be just as exhausting, if not more so, than like the physical chores themselves.
I agree. And to guide us through this mental maze, we have a recent research paper that really kicked up some dust.
Oh, yeah.
And also, we're going to be looking at this fiery Reddit discussion that it sparked. Get ready for some juicy insights and maybe a few aha moments about your own household.
Absolutely. This research used a fancy term, domestic cognitive labor, but really it just means the mental effort that goes into running a household and taking care of the kids.
Yeah.
They surveyed over 3,000 U.S. parents,
Wow.
and they found something pretty striking. Mothers manage about 71% of these mental tasks, compared to fathers' 45%.
71%. That's a significant difference.
It is.
It's almost like mothers have this extra mental workload that's often invisible to others.
Exactly. And the study broke it down even further. They found that mothers tend to shoulder more of the daily tasks, the constant things you do to just keep the household humming, like noticing when the kids are running low on clothes or remembering to buy milk.
It's like that never-ending checklist in our brains, right?
Yeah.
Always anticipating what needs to be done next.
Always.
But what about fathers? What kind of mental load are they typically carrying?
Well, the research suggests that fathers are more focused on what they call episodic tasks. These are things that pop up less frequently. So like handling finances, planning vacations, or dealing with home repairs.
Okay, so it's not like fathers are completely off the hook.
No.
They're just tackling different kinds of mental tasks.
Right.
But wouldn't you say that even those episodic things can create a constant low-level anxiety?
Sure.
I mean, knowing you're responsible for the family budget or something, that can weigh on your mind even when you're not actively crunching numbers.
That's a great point. And that's exactly where the debate started to heat up.
Yeah.
Are those episodic tasks really equal in terms of mental burden?
Right.
Is remembering to buy milk comparable to the stress of making sure you have enough saved for your child's college tuition?
Right. And that's where that Reddit discussion gets really juicy. People were weighing in with their own experiences, arguing about which tasks are truly more mentally taxing.
It's a fascinating window into how differently we experience and value various types of mental work. And, one of the recurring themes on Reddit was this idea of how subjective mental load really is.
Yeah, what's stressful for one person might be a breeze for another.
Exactly.
Some people might find joy in planning a family vacation,
Oh, yeah.
while others dread the endless details in decision-making. It's all about individual perspectives.
Right. And that makes measuring mental load really tricky. It's not just about how much time you spend on a task. It's about the thought processes, the emotional energy, the anticipation, all those invisible things swirling around in your head.
So how do we even begin to untangle this?
Yeah.
Especially when the study found that both mothers and fathers tend to overestimate their contributions to the mental load.
That's the part that really jumped out at me. Even though the data showed mothers handling a larger share, both parents thought they were doing more than they actually were. And what's interesting is that their overestimations often aligned with the types of tasks they were primarily handling.
Hold on, I need to wrap my head around this for a second.
Okay.
So you're saying that mothers who are doing more of those daily, always-on tasks,
Right.
they tend to overestimate how much they're contributing on that front.
Exactly. And fathers who are more focused on those bigger, less frequent tasks, they overestimate their contributions in that domain.
Okay.
It's like we have a built-in bias toward valuing the kind of mental work we do.
Whoa, this is blowing my mind a little. So how do we even begin to level the playing field?
Right.
If we're all walking around with these skewed perceptions of our own contributions,
Yeah.
how can we even have a productive conversation about sharing the mental load?
Good question.
It's like we're looking in a funhouse mirror when it comes to mental load. Everything's distorted. But okay, let's try to break down those skewed perceptions a bit. The researchers actually provided specific examples of tasks that fall into those like daily versus episodic categories, right?
Right. They have this fascinating table listing all sorts of household and childcare tasks and who usually handles them. It's like peeking into the mental load landscape of different families.
So what were some of the tasks that really highlighted the differences? Or maybe even fueled those Reddit debates?
Well, one example that stood out was noticing when children's nails need to be cut. The study found mothers were significantly more likely to handle that one.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. It's
Ah,
not something you'd put on a calendar or anything. You just kind of notice it in the flow
right.
of daily life,
Right,
right?
yeah.
Like, oh, those tiny daggers need a trim.
Exactly. And that's a classic example of that always-on mental load that mothers often carry. They're constantly observing, anticipating, adding to their mental to-do list, even if it's not a formal chore.
But then you compare that to something from the episodic side,
Hmm.
like, oh, I don't know, making sure the smoke detectors are working.
Right.
I remember reading on Reddit that those kinds of tasks were often considered less mentally taxing.
But there's a catch. Yes, checking the smoke detectors isn't an everyday chore, but it requires planning, remembering, maybe even a little research to make sure you're doing it right.
Hmm.
And the potential consequences of forgetting are pretty significant.
Ugh, don't remind me. My own smoke detector started chirping at 3:0 a.m. last week. Talk about a mental load jolt. And, some Redditors pointed out that even if these tasks aren't constant, the underlying worry they can create can be. Like knowing you're responsible for the family's safety or for the house, adds a whole other layer to the mental equation.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that key point. Just because a task is categorized as episodic, it doesn't mean it's a walk in the park mentally.
Right.
There's often a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Okay, so we've got the daily grind versus the less frequent but potentially high-stakes tasks. But the research also found something interesting about single parents.
Right. Yes. It turns out that single parents, both mothers and fathers, reported managing the majority of tasks themselves.
So they're basically handling both the daily and episodic stuff. Solo. Talk about mental load superheroes.
Right. It almost makes you wonder if those traditional gender roles become less pronounced when there isn't a partner involved. Like maybe in a two-parent household, there's more room for those default settings to kick in.
Yeah. It's like when you're the only one there, you just have to do it all, regardless of whether it's traditionally considered a mom or a dad task.
Right.
But that brings up another question. If those ingrained gender roles are playing such a big role, how do we start to challenge them and create a more equitable division of labor?
That's where communication becomes absolutely crucial. It's not about placing blame or keeping score, but rather acknowledging those underlying patterns and having open, honest conversations about how to share the mental load more fairly.
Okay. Easier said than done, right? I mean, we've already established that most of us have these warped perceptions of our own contributions. How do we even begin to have a productive conversation when we're starting from different mental maps?
Well, I think the first step is simply becoming aware of those ingrained biases. Just having this knowledge, knowing that we tend to overestimate our own efforts and undervalue the tasks that our partner handles, that can make a huge difference.
So it's like before we even start talking about who's doing what, we need to check ourselves
Yeah.
and acknowledge that our own viewpoint might be a little skewed.
Exactly. And the research actually provides a helpful framework for those conversations.
Sure.
Remember how they broke down the mental load into daily and episodic tasks?
Uh-huh.
That can be a really useful starting point.
I see where you're going with this.
Oh.
Instead of just saying, hey, you need to help more, you can start being more specific about the types of tasks that are feeling overwhelming.
Right. You can say, I'm feeling really bogged down by all the daily stuff, like remembering snacks for soccer practice and keeping track of school forms.
Right.
Can we find a way to share some of those responsibilities?
Or I know you handle the car maintenance, but I feel like I'm carrying a lot of the mental load around planning and budgeting for those expenses. Can we talk about how to make that feel more balanced?
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from vague complaints to specific examples
Yeah.
and working together to find solutions that feel fair to both partners.
So it's not about one person winning or losing. It's more about finding a way to distribute those mental tasks in a way that feels sustainable for everyone involved.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that the mental load exists, acknowledging that it's often unevenly distributed, and then making a conscious effort to rebalance it.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this research can actually be empowering. It's not just about highlighting a problem, it's giving us a new language and framework to start addressing it. But I'm curious, What were some of the other key takeaways from those Reddit discussions? Did they offer any practical tips for navigating these conversations? So we've talked about the research and the Reddit rabbit hole, and we even started to unpack how those ingrained gender roles can sneak into our relationships. But what about those real world tips? What were people actually saying on Reddit about how to have these tricky conversations?
Well, one thing that kept popping up was the importance of being specific. Like I was saying earlier, it's less about you never help and more about, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed by packing lunches every morning. Could we maybe switch off? Or would you be open to doing it a couple times a week?
Yeah, I can totally see how that would be more effective. It's less accusatory and more collaborative. It's
Hmm.
like framing it as a problem to solve together, not a personal attack.
Exactly. And another thing that really resonated with me was this idea of making the invisible visible. Often the partner who isn't carrying as much of the mental load, they just literally don't see all the things that go into running the household smoothly.
It's like they're living in a well-maintained, magically stocked home, oblivious to the mental gymnastics required to keep it that way. But how do you make that visible without, turning into a martyr or a scorekeeper?
Some Redditors suggested actually writing things down, not to keep a tally or anything, but more to create a shared understanding of all the tasks involved.
Like a mental load inventory almost,
Yeah.
listing out everything from the obvious chores to those less tangible things like remembering birthdays or coordinating play dates.
Right. And even the act of creating that list together, it can be really eye-opening for both partners. It can spark conversations about, which tasks feel most draining, which ones could be streamlined, how to divide them more fairly.
Yeah, this reminds me of a time when my partner and I were feeling totally out of sync. I was resentful, he was confused, and we were both just frustrated. So we sat down and we actually made a list of everything we were each responsible for, both like the practical stuff and the mental energy it required. And let me tell you, it was a game changer.
It's amazing how much clarity that simple act can bring. Suddenly, you're both on the same page, seeing the full picture, and you can start having a more productive conversation about how to adjust things.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful takeaway for our listeners. Even though this research focused on mothers and fathers, the concept of mental load, it applies to all kinds of relationships, right?
Absolutely. Think about roommates, colleagues, even friendships.
Mhm.
Anytime there's shared responsibility, there's also a mental load involved.
And just like with those household tasks, we often fall into patterns based on personality, gender roles, or just plain old habits.
Yeah.
But what this research and those Reddit discussions highlight is that those patterns aren't set in stone.
Right. We can choose to become more aware of the mental load we're each carrying, and we can start having more open and honest conversations about how to share it in a way that feels equitable and sustainable for everyone.
And at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? To feel seen, supported, and like we're part of a team, whether that's in our families, our friendships, or our work lives.
Absolutely.
So there you have it, folks. We've explored the research, dived into the Reddit debates, shared some personal anecdotes, and hopefully given you some tools to start navigating the mental load in your own lives. Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about progress. And even those small conversations, those little adjustments, can make a huge difference in creating a happier, healthier, and more balanced life. Until next time, keep diving deep.